The ground heaved and Sergeant Marin Voss tasted copper. She was face down in rubble that had been a road 30 seconds ago, her cheek pressed against stone hot enough to register through the ballistic weave of her neck guard. The Telvari sun hammered the flats with white light, flat, merciless, the kind of light that stripped shadows to nothing and made the world look like a bleached X-ray. Somewhere behind her, the second transport was still exploding, its hydrogen cells cooking off in a rhythmic series of cracks that punched the air like a slow heartbeat. She rolled onto her side and catalogued herself. Legs, functional. Arms, functional. Helmet display, cracked but readable. Rifle, still slung, stock dented where she'd hit the ground. Ears, ringing, but the ringing was fading, which meant the tympanic membranes were intact. Blood, yes, somewhere left temple, running warm into her collar. Not arterial, not a problem yet. The convoy was dead. She got to her knees and looked. 4 vehicles, Concord standard-issue armored transports, rated against small arms and fragmentation, lay scattered across the Telvari flats like dropped toys. The lead vehicle had taken a particle lance bolt through the engine housing and was burning white-hot, its composite hull peeling away in sheets. The second was the one throwing hydrogen. The third had flipped. The fourth had simply stopped, its entire crew compartment cored through from side to side by a shot that must have been calibrated to the millimeter. 6 shots. Under 2 seconds, from concealed positions along the ridgeline 800 meters south. Marin had been outside the vehicles when the ambush hit, walking the column's right flank on foot, because her instincts had been screaming about the ridgeline for the last 2 kilometers, and she'd learned a long time ago to listen to her instincts. That walk had saved her life. The lance bolt that killed the 4th transport had passed through the space where her seat had been. She keyed her squad channel. Static, fragmented carrier tones. One voice, Private Haruk the Delvani, his translator unit spitting broken syllables that might have been a situation report or might have been a death prayer. The Delvani had 7 words for the state of dying, and only 1 for the state of living, which told you everything you needed to know about their evolutionary history. Haruk, location and status. The clicking stopped, a pause, then with the careful precision of someone translating through damage, south side of, 3rd vehicle I am, not injured, 7 rounds. Hold position, I'm coming to you. She moved in a low crouch along the rubble line, stepping over debris that had been equipment and supplies and, in one case, something she chose not to look at closely. The dust was settling. Through it she could see the ridgeline, a low, broken spine of Telvari stone running east-west, perfect natural cover for an ambush element, and she should have insisted the column detour around it. The convoy commander, Lieutenant Parath, a Solvari, currently unaccounted for, had overruled her because the detour added 40 minutes and the mission brief said maintain schedule. The mission brief hadn't said anything about Kethvaari interdiction forces operating this far inside the Concord's peacekeeping zone. Nobody had. The intelligence packet was 3 days old and it put the nearest Kethvaari units 80 kilometers south. Either the intelligence was wrong or the Kethvaari had moved fast. Either way, the result was burning behind her. She found Haruk. The Delvani was pressed flat against a slab of hull plating from the 3rd transport, his elongated frame folded into a space that looked too small for him. His species was built for compression. Evolution's answer to a homeworld, riddled with narrow cave systems and predators that hunted by silhouette. He could flatten his torso to half its standing depth, which was useful for hiding and unsettling to watch. His scales had gone the color of old ice. Pale, almost translucent, a Delvani fear response as involuntary as a human's pupil dilation and roughly as controllable. But his weapon was up. His eyes were tracking. The professional discipline she'd spent 3 months drilling into him was holding, and it was holding against biology, which was the hardest opponent any soldier ever fought. "Stay on me," she said. She moved past the 3rd transport and found Corporal Ewan. He dragged himself behind the overturned chassis of the lead vehicle, leaving a dark smear across the pale stone. His left leg was wrong below the knee. The armor had absorbed the thermal component of the lance splash, but kinetic energy didn't care about armor, and the bone underneath had taken the full transfer. He'd improvised a splint from a broken antenna strut and tied it with strips of his own medkit wrapping. Clean work. Field manual work. The kind of thing a veteran did when he'd accepted the situation and moved straight through to the practical part. "Ewan, talk to me." "Tibia's gone, maybe fibula too." "Tourniquets holding." He looked up at her with eyes that were clear and hard and not asking for sympathy. "I can shoot, Sarge. Can't walk, can't run, but I can shoot. That's all I need you to do." She put a hand on his shoulder, brief, firm, the gesture Palk had used when words were surplus. Then she moved on. She found Dreel in a crevice between two slabs of blown hull plating. The Telvari was field stripping a jammed pulse carbine with two of his four hands while pressing a clotting patch against his own neck with a third. His fourth arm hung limp, the forearm bent at an angle that made Marin's own joints ache in sympathy, a compound fracture, the bone pressing against the inner surface of his exoskeletal plating without quite breaking through. Lance Corporal Dreel, Telvari. Four-armed, broad-shouldered, built like industrial equipment wrapped in a leather coat. He'd been a communications technician before the war, 6 years servicing Alliance relay arrays, and he'd been reassigned to Marin's platoon because the Concord was short on bodies and long on optimism. He was the best field electronics operator she'd ever worked with, and right now he was bleeding from the neck, holding his own wound closed, and fixing a weapon simultaneously, and his expression was the Telvari equivalent of mild irritation. Dreel carbine status. 40 seconds, he didn't look up. His 3 working hands moved with the synchronized precision of a watchmaker, each finger operating independently, the adhesive pads on the fingertips gripping components too small for human hands to manage without tools. Charge is at 40%, 30 controlled bursts, maybe 35. "And you?" He glanced at his broken arm. "It's not going to get worse unless someone hits it. I'll manage." She took stock. 4 effectives, 1 human Marine sergeant with 14 rifle rounds and 8 sidearm rounds, a Delvani private with 7 rounds and scales the color of fear, a human corporal with a broken leg and steady hands, and a Telvari lance corporal with a broken arm and a carbine at 40%. No comms, the long-range relay had been in the second vehicle, the one currently performing an impromptu fireworks display. No air support. The nearest friendly position was Firebase Calden Notch, 18 kilometers northeast across open flats. Against them, a Kethvaari interdiction element of unknown size, holding the high ground with at least 3 vehicle-mounted particle lance platforms. She belly crawled to the edge of the rubble line and raised her helmet optic. The magnification was degraded. The crack ran right through the center of the display, but she could see enough. Kethvaari, moving on the ridgeline. Cephalopod-derived, the xenobiology brief said. Mottled gray skin that shifted between slate and charcoal depending on mood and environment. 8 limbs, 2 upper pairs specialized for manipulation and weapon mounting. 4 lower limbs providing a fluid, unsettlingly fast locomotion that made them look like they were pouring across the ground rather than running. Sensory clusters on the cranial dome, bioluminescent, pulsing blue when they echolocated through dust or smoke. Minimal armor. They didn't need much. Their distributed nervous system made them hard to drop with body shots, and their speed made them hard to hit in the first place. She counted. 2 fire team-sized elements moving along the ridge, 12 to 16 infantry. 3 fire support platforms with elevated lance arrays. Support crews. She estimated 35 to 40 total combatants. The clicking started. Kethvaari communication, rapid percussive mandible strikes. each click carrying pitch and duration, data that their translation systems rendered as flat, affectless statements. She'd heard enough of it during 3 months of patrol rotations on Telvari Prime to pick out the gross rhythm. This rhythm was confident, organized, the rhythm of a force that had executed a textbook ambush and was now preparing to collect what was left. "They think we're dead," she said, mostly to herself. "We're close," Ewan said from behind her. She almost smiled, almost Driel carbine. "Done," he slid it across the rubble. She caught it, confirmed the charge indicator, and slid it back. "You're our volume. Short bursts only, 3-round max. Target the lower locomotion limbs. They can't dodge if they can't move." "Understood." She turned to Haruk. The Delvani was watching the ridgeline with the frozen attention of a prey animal tracking a predator's approach. Every instinct in his evolutionary history was telling him to flatten, to compress, to disappear into the narrowest available space and wait for the danger to pass. He was overriding all of it. He was standing at his position with his weapon up and his breathing controlled and his scales the color of death, and he was choosing to do it. "Haruk, you're on the platforms. 7 rounds, 7 shots. The gunners sit behind armored cowlings, but the vision slits are exposed. You've got the best optics in this squad. Delvani visual acuity at range is better than anything we carry. The slits are narrow, Sergeant." "I've seen you hit narrower," she had. On the ranges at Camp Voreth 6 weeks ago, Haruk had put 5 consecutive shots through a 10-centimeter target ring at 400 meters using iron sights. His species had evolved under predation pressure from aerial hunters with near-perfect camouflage. If you couldn't spot a threat that looked exactly like the sky, you didn't reproduce. The result was the best distance vision in the Concord's biological catalog. He darkened half a shade. Among Delvani, that was the equivalent of squaring your shoulders. He adjusted his grip and sighted on the ridgeline. "Ewan, rear security. Anything comes through the smoke on our 6, you handle it." "Copy." He'd gotten himself braced against the transport's undercarriage, his rifle propped on a twisted strut, his broken leg extended in front of him at an angle he'd clearly found through painful experimentation. His fire lane covered the northern approach and the smoke from the burning vehicles. It was a good position, a thinking position. "What's the play, Sarge?" The question sat in the air between them. She considered lying, she considered a speech, she discarded both. "We hold this rubble. We make them pay for every meter until they break contact or we're dry. Then we improvise." "Define improvise." "I'll let you know when I get there." She checked the optic again. The Kethvaari first wave was forming, 6 infantry breaking from cover on the ridgeline, beginning the flowing downslope movement that would bring them across 400 meters of open ground to the rubble line. Their clicking was rapid and confident. The mandible strikes of a force executing a mop-up, a corpse run. "Driel, left cluster on my mark." The 6 Kethvaari reached the open flats and accelerated. Their lower limbs moved in a coordinated ripple that covered ground with frightening speed. Bipedal species couldn't match it on flat terrain. Mottled gray bodies flowing across pale stone like dirty water. 200 meters, 150, 100. "Hold." 80, she could see the individual limbs now. The weapon mounts grafted to the upper pair, compact particle projectors, lighter than the vehicle-mounted lances but plenty lethal at this range. Sensory clusters pulsing blue, mandibles clicking. 60 meters. "Now." Driel's carbine cracked, 3 shots, precisely spaced. 2 Kethvaari pitched sideways in mid-stride, their lower locomotion limbs shattered, gray bodies tumbling across stone in sprays of dark ichor. The remaining 4 froze for exactly 1.2 seconds, she counted, because the pause told her everything about their training level, and then scattered into evasive patterns. "Haruk Platform 1, Gunner." The Delvani's rifle barked. On the ridgeline, 400 meters distant, The lead fire support platform's lance array swiveled aimlessly for a moment and then stopped. The gunner had slumped behind the cowling. Through her cracked optic, Marin could see the neat hole in the vision slit. 6 rounds left for Haruk. Return fire came 3 seconds later. The 2 remaining lance platforms opened up simultaneously, searing white bolts that turned rubble into glass wherever they struck. Marin pressed flat as a bolt passed close enough to heat-scorch the back of her neck armor. Fragments of fused stone rattled against her helmet like hot gravel. Shift positions. Drill right, Haruk left, move now. They moved. Not fast. Drill's broken arm made him awkward, and Haruk had to fight every centimeter against the biological imperative to freeze in place. But they moved. And they moved together, covering each other's transitions, maintaining fire lanes, doing it by the book because the book was the only structure standing between 4 people and the void. 90 seconds of silence. Then the second wave. 8 Kethvaari this time, approaching from 2 angles, a pincer that told Marin their field commander was competent and had correctly identified the rubble line as a defended position rather than a random debris field. They came fast, faster than the first wave, and they came smart, using the terrain, using each other for cover, leapfrogging in disciplined bounds. Marin dropped one at 60 meters, a clean shot through the sensory cluster that killed it mid-stride, the body tumbling end over end across the stone and leaving a dark streak. Drill's carbine cut 2 more at the knees, their locomotion limbs collapsing, bodies sliding across the flat ground in tangled heaps of gray limbs. The remaining 5 reached the rubble line. Close quarters. A Kethvaari came over the debris pile 3 meters to Marin's left. She put 2 rounds into its center mass. It kept coming, the distributed nervous system absorbing the damage, rerouting function, maintaining motor control through redundant pathways that made the organism shockingly hard to kill with anything short of a headshot or total structural failure. She sidestepped the lunge of its weapon arms, caught one of them, and used the creature's own forward momentum to redirect it into a jutting piece of hull plating. The impact was final, wet and structural and unmistakable. The Kethvaari crumpled and did not move again. She heard Drill behind her, a sound she'd never heard the Telvari make in 3 months of deployment. Not a shout, a roar, the deep-chest vocalization of a species that had evolved as mid-tier predators on a high-gravity world and still carried the hardware. Then the distinctive sound of 4-armed close combat, multiple impacts, overlapping, rhythmic, efficient. When she turned, Drill was standing over Kethvaari's body. 3 working hands, dark ichor that wasn't his running down his forearms. Breathing hard. His broken arm tucked against his chest. Status. Adequate. The word came out flat and exact, and she almost respected it. Haruk had held his position. 2 Kethvaari bodies lay at the base of his cover, one shot through the sensory cluster at point-blank range, one still twitching with its upper manipulator limbs pinned under a chunk of debris that the Delvani had apparently toppled onto it. Haruk's scales were almost transparent. His hands were shaking, but his weapon was still up. 5 rounds left. The reprieve lasted long enough for Marin to do the thing she hated most, count the dead. She moved through the rubble perimeter in a low crouch, cataloging what the 2 waves had cost the Kethvaari. 9 bodies. 9 gray shapes cooling on pale stone in the flat white sunlight, their bioluminescent clusters dimming from blue to nothing as the organisms shut down. Some were still twitching, the distributed nervous system running its final diagnostics on a body that no longer had the structural integrity to use them. What she looked for was intelligence. Kethvaari field gear was modular, and somewhere in each soldier's kit was a tactical display. She found one on the 3rd body, a flat screen, cracked but functional, strapped to the creature's upper manipulator limb. The display was in Kethvaari glyphics, but the tactical overlay was universal. Blue dots for friendly, red for hostile, terrain contours, range rings. She read it in 4 seconds and felt her stomach tighten. The interdiction element was bigger than she'd estimated. Not 40, closer to 50. The additional troops had been held in reserve behind the ridge, out of her optics line of sight. The field commander had committed less than half its force in the first 2 waves. It had been probing, testing, measuring the defense's capability and response time with the clinical detachment of a surgeon mapping a wound before cutting. The 3rd wave would be the surgery. She relayed the intelligence. Nobody spoke for 5 seconds. 5 seconds of the flat silence pressing in, broken only by the click-tick of cooling wreckage and the distant mandible chatter of the Kethvaari reserve element repositioning behind the ridge. 50, Ewan said. His voice was flat, professional. The voice of a man who'd heard bad numbers before and understood that the correct response was better planning, not despair. Give or take. Marin stripped the tactical display from the dead Kethvaari's limb and clipped it to her own forearm plate. The dots would update in real time as long as the enemy's tactical net stayed active. Their own discipline was going to be her intelligence feed. The reserve element is dug in behind the ridgeline. Infantry, support platforms, and what looks like a command vehicle. When they come, they'll come with everything. Dreel studied the display. His 4 eyes tracked the glyph patterns with the analytical focus of someone who'd spent years reading technical readouts in alien script. Timing indicator, upper left quadrant. Based on the cycle rate, 8 to 10 minutes before the next phase initiates. 8 minutes. The rest of her tactical planning horizon fit inside the span of time it took to boil water on a camp stove. Then we have 8 minutes to change the equation, she said. 4 minutes of quiet. Marin used every second. She crawled through the burning wreckage of the second vehicle, holding her breath against the chemical stink of combusting hydrogen cells, and found the emergency transponder. Conquered standard issue, a hardened brick of circuitry and battery, designed to survive the kind of catastrophe that destroyed everything else. It was intact. Its external antenna wasn't. The mounting bracket had been sheared clean. The composite rod snapped and partially melted. Without the antenna, the transponder's range was 2 kilometers at best. Useless. Calden Notch was 18 clicks out. She stared at the brick, then at the ridgeline, then at the disabled fire support platform, sitting silent on the ridge with its dead gunner slumped behind the cowling and its antenna cluster. A branching array of composite rods designed to punch signals across hundreds of kilometers, still intact on the upper hull. The math assembled itself the way field math always did. Ugly, obvious, and non-negotiable. Dreel, how good are you with cross-platform electronics? I serviced Alliance communications arrays for 6 years. He said it without emphasis because competence didn't need emphasis. What are you thinking? Kethvaari antenna cluster, conquered transponder. Can you make them talk? He tilted his head, the Sulvari expression for running a problem through multiple parallel considerations. The impedance mismatch will be significant. I'll need to strip the shielding and direct wire the feed. The signal will be rough, but with enough power pushing through it, the range might reach 8 to 12 kilometers. That gets us Calden Notch. It also gets us detected by every Kethvaari receiver on the planet. I want them to detect it. I want them to know help is coming and decide whether the math still works. She briefed the plan in 40 seconds. Dreel and Ewan hold the rubble, work the transponder prep. Marin and Haruk cross 400 meters of open ground under Lance platform fire, reach the disabled platform on the ridge, strip its antenna and bring it back. If they made it, Dreel spliced the antenna, they punched the distress call, and Calden Na scrambled everything it had. If they didn't make it, Dreel improvised with whatever he could find, hull scrap, armor plating, anything conductive. Nobody asked for a better plan. There wasn't one. Haruk's scales had gone beyond pale into something that looked like glass. She could see the vasculature underneath, thin blue lines pulsing with each heartbeat. His species processed fear as a paralytic. the evolutionary logic being that a motionless prey animal was harder to detect than a fleeing one. What Haruk was doing by standing up, checking his weapon, and nodding at her was the Telvari equivalent of walking into a fire. He was overriding 100 million years of survival programming on the strength of 3 months of training, and whatever it was that made him nod instead of freeze. "Stay on my 6, she said. "When I stop, you stop. When I shoot, you shoot. We go fast and we don't stop until we're there." "Yes, Sergeant." She turned to Dreel. "Start the prep work now. Transponder open, wiring exposed, ready to receive. The second I hand you that antenna, I want it transmitting." The Telvari looked at her with all 4 eyes, the 2 primary, and the 2 secondary lateral orbs that gave his species near-spherical peripheral vision. "Sergeant, if you don't come back, I'll make it work with what I have. A hull fragment, an armor plate, something." She held his gaze. "I know you will." She went over the rubble line at a dead sprint. The first 30 meters were covered, wreckage, debris, a shallow drainage channel cut into the flats by seasonal runoff. She and Haruk moved through it fast, weapons up, staying low. At the channel's end, the cover died. 370 meters of open stone stretched between them and the ridgeline, every centimeter of it in the fire arcs of 2 Kethvaari lance platforms. Marin didn't slow down. She broke from the channel and ran. The first lance bolt hit 4 meters to her right. The stone flash fused into glass and exploded outward, and she felt the shrapnel pepper her armor like hot needles. She zagged left. Another bolt, behind her this time, tracking. The platform gunners were trained for vehicle-scale targets, and their tracking servos had a recalibration lag that she could feel in the rhythm of the shots. 1.4 seconds between acquisitions. She counted the interval and changed direction on each count. 300 meters, 250. The air was a furnace, the Telvari atmosphere at 0.84 standard, thin enough to make every breath feel like sucking air through a damp rag. She'd trained for this. Low atmo sprints at elevation until your vision grayed and your legs went to rubber and gunnery. Sergeant Polk's voice in your earpiece said again. And you went again. Because Polk didn't believe in human limits, and eventually you stopped believing in them too. 200 meters. She could feel her heartbeat in her teeth. The deep, hammering rhythm that meant her cardiovascular system had shifted into the gear that evolution had built for exactly this, the final sprint. Her species had evolved as persistence hunters on the savannas of a world that killed 96% of everything that tried to live on it. They'd chased prey across open ground under a sun that would have killed a Telvari in 40 minutes. The body remembered. The body always remembered. Beside her, Haruk was flagging. The Telvari respiratory system was designed for short, explosive bursts of speed, not sustained aerobic output across open ground in thin atmosphere. His breathing had gone ragged, and his stride was shortening. She could see the moment approaching when his biology would override his will, and his legs would simply stop. She reached out and grabbed his equipment harness. Not gently. The way Polk had grabbed hers once on a forced march through the Sarathi mud flats when her 18-year-old legs had tried to quit. She hauled him forward, physically dragging him through the next 10 strides until his own momentum caught up and his legs found the rhythm again. He didn't thank her, he didn't have the breath. But his eyes found hers, and something passed between them that didn't need air. A bolt hit close enough to flash blind her right eye. She blinked the afterimage away and kept running. Her legs were burning. Her lungs were raw. The body was lodging formal complaints through every available channel, and she overrode every one of them with the same cold authority she used to override everything. The same engine that Polk had built and tuned and tested until it ran clean on fury and nothing else. 150. She could hear the clicking now, Kethvaari infantry on the ridge, reacting to the 2 figures sprinting toward their position across open ground. The clicks were fast and confused, the sound of organisms encountering behavior that didn't fit their models. 100 meters. The disabled platform was visible, squat, tracked, its dead lance array drooping at an angle. The antenna cluster sat on the upper hull, a branching array of composite rods extending upward like the skeleton of a metal tree. 50 meters. She was close enough to see the dead gunner's sensory cluster, dark and inert behind the vision slit. She slid into cover behind the platform's tracks and her hands were already working. Standard Kethvaari quick disconnect on the antenna mounts, a twist-and-pull mechanism designed for field replacement. She grabbed the first antenna rod, twisted, pulled. It came free. She grabbed the second, twisted. It stuck. She braced her boot against the hull and pulled harder, and something in her shoulder objected, and the rod came free with a snap of broken mounting clips. Hara cover. The Telvari had made it. He was flattened against the platform's hull, not from training but from instinct, his body doing what 100 million years had taught it to do, compressing into the smallest possible silhouette. But his rifle was up and aimed at the ridgetop, and his eyes were scanning with the preternatural acuity that made his species the finest sharpshooters in the Conquered's catalog. A Kethvaari rose from the rocks 10 meters above them. Haruk fired. The shot took it through the base of the sensory cluster, and it tumbled down the slope trailing dark fluid. 5 rounds. Another appeared. Haruk fired. 4. A third, faster, rushing the platform from the east. Haruk's hands moved with the fluid certainty of someone operating beyond conscious thought, the rifle tracking, acquiring, firing in a single continuous motion that looked less like marksmanship and more like reflex. 3 rounds. Time to move. The run back was worse. The Kethvaari had adjusted. The lance bolts came closer now, the tracking algorithms recalibrated, the gunners no longer firing at vehicle speed targets but at 2 sprinting organisms whose evasion pattern they'd had time to analyze. Halfway across the open ground, a bolt struck the stone directly ahead of Marin and she ran through the flash. Blind. Deaf. Running on dead reckoning and muscle memory, and the absolute refusal to stop moving, because stopping was dying and she hadn't finished yet. She hit the drainage channel, dropped, rolled into cover and pressed her face against cool stone and breathed. Haruk landed beside her 3 seconds later, shaking, his entire body vibrating with the post-adrenaline tremor that was the Telvari equivalent of a human screaming into a pillow. His scales were clicking against each other, a soft, involuntary rattle that mimicked the enemy's language. But he was alive. He was here. He had crossed 400 meters of open killing ground twice, because his sergeant had crossed it first. "Good work," she said. He looked at her. His eyes held something that crossed species lines, not courage, because courage was too large a word for what happened in a drainage ditch on a bad afternoon. It was smaller, quieter. It was the decision to be present, the decision to move when the body said stop, the decision to stand next to someone because they were standing next to you, and that reciprocity was older than language and deeper than training and worth more than every tactical manual ever written. "We go," she said. He nodded. They went. They made it back to the rubble. Driel had the transponder open on a flat piece of hull plating, its internals exposed in a precise layout that showed 6 years of professional discipline. He took the antenna components from Marin, examined them for exactly 3 seconds, and started working. 3 hands moving in a choreography of splice and solder and strip, mating Kethvaari composite cabling to Conquered signal architecture with the focused intensity of someone performing the task that mattered most. Time. 3 minutes, maybe 4. The impedance bridge is the bottleneck. I'm having to build a matching circuit from scratch with field components. Marin checked on Ewan. The corporal had held his position and added to his resume. 2 Kethvaari bodies lay on the far side of his cover, both with single shots through the sensory cluster. Clean kills. Economical. The work of a man who understood that every round was a finite resource and treated each one accordingly. His face was gray. blood loss and pain compounding. But his weapon was still up, his eyes were still clear, and when she met his gaze, what she saw was the thing she'd seen in every good Marine she'd ever served with in the moments after the crisis clarified itself. The quiet certainty that the only way out was through. "Sarge," his voice was thin now, effort showing, "they're massing." She got back on her optic. The Kethvaari were consolidating behind a low rock formation 80 meters south. Not fire teams this time. The full remaining force, she counted 12 infantry, plus the 2 surviving lance platforms repositioning for converging fire arcs. A field commander was visible among them, taller than the infantry, its armor marked with bioluminescent rank glyphs that pulsed a slow, authoritative amber. This wasn't a probe, this was the finish. She checked the Kethvaari tactical display one last time. The blue dots were moving. The entire reserve element was coming up from behind the ridge in a single consolidated formation. The field commander had committed everything. No more probes, no more measured testing. This was the equation's final term. She felt it then, the moment she always felt before the last push, not fear. Fear had burned away somewhere on the open ground between the drainage channel and the ridgeline, incinerated by adrenaline and thin atmosphere, and the primal stubbornness of a Deathworld organism that had been refusing to die for 10,000 generations. Not resignation. Resignation was for organisms that had run out of options, and she had 3 sidearm rounds and a team, and a transponder that was 90 seconds from changing everything. What she felt was clarity. The cold, surgical clarity that came when fury had burned away everything unnecessary and left only the problem and the solution and the distance between them. Paulk had called it the clean place, the place where the noise stopped and the work began. She counted ammunition, 9 rifle rounds, 8 sidearm. Driel's carbine at maybe 20%, 10 to 12 bursts. Haruk with 3. Ewan down to his last magazine, which from his expression held single digits. Roughly 40 rounds, all calibers, against a massed assault of 12-plus infantry supported by vehicle-mounted particle lances. Driel time. 2 minutes, maybe less if I skip the insulation. Skip it. The clicking out on the flats had stopped. When the Kethvaari stopped clicking, they'd finished deliberating. The actuarial math was complete. The decision was made. Marin positioned what she had. Haruk on the left, covering the northern approach where the terrain offered the most cover for flanking elements. Ewan holding center, immobile but anchored, his broken leg braced and his fire lane clear. Marin on the right, where the main force would come, because the terrain funneled that direction, and because she intended to be the first thing they hit. And Driel behind all of them, building a radio from 2 species incompatible electronics with 3 hands and a broken arm, and the unhurried precision of someone who understood that speed without accuracy was just fast failure. She pressed her cheek against her rifle stock and waited. She thought about Paulk, always Paulk in these moments, the old gunny who'd taken an 18-year-old recruit full of undirected fury and turned her into something useful. Not by removing the fury, Paulk had understood fury better than anyone Marin had ever met. He taught her to channel it, to burn it clean. Fury wasn't fire, Paulk said. Fury was fuel. You didn't let it control the engine. You fed it in, controlled and metered, and it pushed the legs that wanted to stop and steadied the hands that wanted to shake and kept the mind locked on the problem when every cell in your body was screaming at you to break. She was burning it now, low and steady and clean, the fury of a woman who'd watched her convoy die and was not going to watch her squad follow it. The Kethvaari came. They came from 3 directions, south, southeast, southwest, and they came fast, and they came together, and the first 15 seconds were a controlled catastrophe of overlapping fire arcs and practice discipline, and the raw, ugly math of 4 against many. Marin fired 3 rounds, 2 dropped sensory cluster shots, instant kills. Driel's carbine stuttered bursts into the southeastern element and scattered their formation, bodies tumbling, locomotion limbs shattered. Haruk fired once, a 300-meter shot at a flanking element that dropped a Kethvaari mid-stride and sent the two behind it diving for cover that didn't exist on open flats. 2 rounds left. Ewan held center and placed shots with the deliberate calm of a man who'd made peace with his ammunition count and intended to make every round a monument. A lance bolt hit the rubble 2 meters from Driel. The blast threw the Telvari sideways, and Marin saw him curl around the transponder, his body between it and the explosion, his back taking the shrapnel, his 3 working hands wrapped around the device like a parent shielding an infant. He hit the ground, rolled, and kept working. Blood from a new laceration ran across his back plates in a dark sheet. He didn't acknowledge it. Driel. 60 seconds, keep them off me. The Kethvaari closed to 30 meters. Marin's rifle clicked empty on the 9th round. She transitioned to her sidearm smooth, practiced, the handoff so drilled it happened below conscious thought. The pistol barked, and a gray body folded at 20 meters. Another was climbing the rubble to her left. She kicked it in the sensory cluster, the most sensitive point on the anatomy, a mass of electroreceptive tissue that processed the Kethvaari equivalent of hearing, smell, and spatial orientation simultaneously. The creature recoiled, mandibles flaring in a pain reflex that exposed the unarmored gap between its throat plates. She put a round through the gap. 5 sidearm rounds remaining. Haruk, your left. The Delvani spun. A Kethvaari had flanked through the smoke of the burning vehicles, coming around Ewan's blind side, fast and low and closing. Haruk fired his second-to-last round and hit it through the upper manipulator limb. Not a kill shot. The creature staggered but kept coming, its remaining weapon arm swinging toward Haruk's position. Haruk fired his last round, through the sensory cluster at 12 meters. The Kethvaari dropped 2 body lengths from his position and slid to a stop against the rubble. Empty, his rifle was empty. He didn't freeze, didn't compress. Didn't go to ground the way 100 million years of biological imperative demanded. He slung his empty rifle, drew his utility blade, a 10-centimeter ceramic edge issued for cutting ration packaging and cable ties, and moved to cover Driel's exposed flank. A Delvani, a prey species, standing in the open with a box cutter between a wounded mechanic and the galaxy's most efficient predatory infantry, because his sergeant had said hold and he had decided that hold meant hold. Marin saw it. She filed it in the place where she kept the things that would outlast her, the quiet ledger of moments that proved the math wrong, that broke every actuarial table, that no xenobiology paper would ever adequately explain. The lance platforms fired together. The rubble line disintegrated. The world became shrapnel and noise in the high, thin singing of superheated air, and Marin was on the ground, ears gone, vision narrowed to a tunnel, blood from the temple wound running into her eye. Her sidearm was in her hand. She had no memory of drawing it after being thrown. The body had handled it. The body handled everything when the mind went white. It fell back on 10,000 repetitions, 10,000 drills, the muscle memory that Palk had built into her like rebar into concrete. She stood up. A Kethvaari 5 meters away, weapon arms raised, mandibles spread in the kill configuration, the widest possible gape, designed to intimidate and expose the venom channels that lined the inner mandible surface. She shot it twice. It dropped. 3 rounds left. Behind her, Driel's voice strained, wet, but absolutely clear. Done. The transponder's activation tone cut through the chaos like a blade through cloth. A sharp, clean note, the specific frequency that every conquered receiver within range was programmed to prioritize above all other traffic. The signal punched outward across the Telvari flats, rough and distorted by the improvised antenna match but carrying the data that mattered. Conquered emergency, priority 1, coordinates embedded, personnel alive, under fire, requesting immediate extraction and support. The digital equivalent of lighting a flare in the dark and daring something to answer. The firing paused, not a ceasefire, a calculation pause. The Kethvaari had heard the signal too. Their own receivers had picked it up, and now every surviving member of the interdiction element was processing the same information. A conquered distress call, broadcasting coordinates, requesting reinforcements from a fire base 18 kilometers away. Reinforcements that, at conquered rapid reaction speed, could be overhead in 12 to 15 minutes. A Kethvaari officer emerged from the settling dust. The field commander she'd spotted earlier, taller, heavier, its armor etched with rank glyphs that pulsed slow amber. It stopped 20 meters from the rubble line and surveyed the position with the methodical attention of its species. 4 defenders, one unable to walk, one holding a utility blade, one bleeding from the back. All of them spent, all of them damaged, and all of them still facing outward with weapons up or blades drawn, still occupying the position, still refusing to stop. Marin aimed her sidearm at the officer's sensory cluster. 3 rounds. She'd make the first one count and improvise from there. The officer clicked. Rapid, complex, directed at her position or at the rubble line in general. She couldn't tell, and it didn't matter. Her rudimentary Kethvaari caught fragments. Signal transmitted, reinforcement probability high, timeline insufficient, cost ratio exceeding operational threshold, recommend disengage. It was running the numbers. The same actuarial math that governed every Kethvaari tactical decision from squad-level patrol to fleet engagement. Cost versus benefit. Loss versus gain. The clean algebra of war that had made them the most militarily efficient species in the Conquered's operational theater and the most dangerous ground force on 6 contested worlds. The algebra that had one variable it couldn't solve for. The officer's rank glyphs shifted, amber to blue, combat to withdrawal. It issued a rapid series of commands, mandibles striking in precise patterns, and the surviving Kethvaari began pulling back, smoothly, efficiently, their retreat as mathematically perfect as their assault had been. No panic, no disorder, just the clean execution of a force that had recalculated and found the equation no longer balanced. They were gone in 90 seconds. The flats went quiet, not silence, the absence of what had been filling the air. A negative space shaped like violence, slowly filling with the crackle of dying fires and the soft tick of cooling metal and the sound of 4 people breathing. Marin stood in the wreckage and let the quiet settle over her like dust. Behind her, Driel was sitting against the transponder housing, 3 hands resting in his lap, the broken 4th cradled against his chest. Blood was drying on his back in dark, cracking lines. His eyes were half closed, not from unconsciousness, but from the specific exhaustion of a body that had spent everything it had and was now running on the residual charge in its cells. Haruk was on his knees. His utility blade was still in his hand. He stared at it like he wasn't sure what it was or how it had gotten there or why he was still holding it. His scales were slowly darkening, cycling back from translucent terror toward their natural deep-sea green as the adrenaline analog cleared his bloodstream. The trembling had stopped. What replaced it was a stillness that looked like it went all the way down, the stillness of someone who had discovered what they were, and was not yet sure whether the discovery was a gift or a wound. Ewan had let his rifle rest on the strut. His head was tilted back against the chassis, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow but rhythmic. The tourniquet was holding, but his face had the gray-white pallor of someone approaching a limit. He'd need surgery inside the hour. Marin's field medicine training put the window at maybe 90 minutes before the tissue below the tourniquet started dying for good. But he was alive and he was conscious, and when she said his name, he opened one eye and said, "Still here, Sarge." She sat down. Not by choice, her legs made the decision for her. The fury finally burned through, the fuel tank reading empty. She sat in the rubble of the convoy she'd been assigned to protect, the convoy that was now 4 pillars of smoke against a white sky, and she looked at the 3 beings who had held the line beside her, and she let herself feel, for just a moment, the thing she normally kept locked behind the cold procedural wall that Palk had built and she had maintained. Not gratitude, not relief, something older and less comfortable. Something that had no name in Concord's standard, because the Concord's diplomatic language had been designed for precision, and this thing was not precise. It was ragged and warm, and it lived in the space between fury and brotherhood. The space where the animal need to survive met the decision to survive together, and became something that neither word could hold on its own. It wasn't about species classification. It wasn't about homeworld gravity or evolutionary heritage or the biomechanical advantages that made humans useful to the Concord's mixed species military. The xenobiologists had a term for what humans did: pack bonding, they called it. An evolutionary artifact from a Class 17 Deathworld. The tendency to form loyalty bonds with non-kin, to extend the survival instinct outward until it covered everyone within arm's reach, regardless of taxonomy. They wrote papers about it, ran studies, presented findings at conferences with titles like Interspecific Loyalty Bonding in Deathworld Origin Primates, and discussed it in the clinical language of researchers examining a curiosity. They missed the point. It wasn't a human thing, not exclusively, not anymore. It was a choice thing. It was the Telvari who shielded a radio with his broken body because the radio was the squad's way home. The Delvani who crossed open ground with a box cutter because his sergeant crossed it first. The human corporal who held center on a shattered leg and never once asked to be excused from the line. Pack behavior worked because it ran both directions. You held for them because they held for you. And somewhere in that reciprocity, in the ugly, beautiful, non-negotiable math of it, there was something that no actuarial table had a column for and no evolutionary biologist had adequately named. Driel reached out with one of his working hands and gripped Marin's wrist. The Telvari grip, 4 independently jointed fingers with adhesive pads, strong enough to crush industrial tubing if applied with intent. He didn't crush. He held, firm, deliberate, and he said one word in the Telvari tongue that his translator unit didn't render because the concept existed in no other language in the Concord's diplomatic index. She'd heard the word once before, spoken by a Telvari platoon sergeant who'd used it to describe his Bond brothers, the 4 soldiers he'd served with for 9 years, the ones he called not kin who are kin. Concord xenolinguists had noted it as a cultural artifact, species-specific, untranslatable. They'd filed it under the heading of interesting phenomena and moved on. Marin didn't need the translation. She'd been the words meaning all afternoon, so had he. She looked across the rubble at the 4 positions they'd held. 4 craters in the debris, each one worn smooth by the boots and bodies that had occupied it. 4 firing positions that had held against 10-to-1 odds with improvised equipment and borrowed ammunition, and the kind of stubborn, grinding refusal to quit that made no evolutionary sense unless you understood what it was for. The xenobiologists would call it an anomaly. The tacticians would call it an outlier. The actuarial models would flag it and assign it a probability coefficient so low that any rational planning body would discard it as noise. But it wasn't noise, it was signal. The clearest, simplest signal in the galaxy we hold for each other. Every species in the Concord had a version of it. The Telvari Bond Brotherhood. The Delvani Warrens, where 100 individuals shared a single cave system and defended it collectively against predators that outweighed them 50-to-1. Even the Kethvaari had their squad-level cohesion, each unit functioning as a single distributed organism with shared tactical awareness. The difference was scope. For most species, the bond stopped at the boundary of kin or clan or hive. For humans, it stopped nowhere. It reached out and grabbed whatever was next to it and held on, and the strength of the grip had nothing to do with taxonomy and everything to do with proximity and shared time, and the experience of surviving something that should have killed you. 3 months, that was all it had taken. 3 months of patrols and drills and shared meals and bad coffee and worse weather. And Marin's pack instinct had wrapped itself around a 4-armed mechanic and a terrified sharpshooter and a broken-legged corporal, and claimed them as completely as if they'd been born in the same hospital. Palk would have understood. Palk had always understood. She squeezed his hand back, hard enough that he'd feel it through the adhesive pads. The sound reached them 11 minutes later. Low at first, building the deep-throated roar of conquered dropships inbound from Caldon Notch, their turbines chewing through the thin Telvari atmosphere with the authority of machines built for exactly this kind of emergency. Haruk heard them first, his auditory range picking up the turbine harmonics before they were visible, his head snapping up, his scales flushing a color Marin had never seen on a Delvani, dark, even, certain. "Sergeant, they're coming." She nodded. She was looking at her hands, dust-caked, blood-streaked, steady. The hands that had pulled a radio antenna off a dead platform at a dead sprint under fire. The hands that had killed today and would kill again and would never once do it in anger, because anger was wasteful and imprecise and Palk had taught her better. The dropships landed in a storm of displaced dust. Medics deployed in practiced pairs, each team moving to a casualty, with the efficient urgency of professionals who understood that timelines were not negotiable. Someone was in front of Marin asking questions: rank, unit designator, casualty count, nature of enemy contact, estimated enemy strength. She answered on autopilot, the words correct and complete and already fading from her memory as she said them. Ewan was loaded first. He needed the surgical table at Caldon inside the hour, and the medics moved him with hands that were quick and careful and entirely without wasted motion. He caught Marin's eye as the stretcher lifted, and he gave her a nod, small, tight, weighted with everything that wouldn't fit in a word. Then the ramp closed and the dropship lifted and he was gone, and she'd see him again in 6 weeks, rebuilt and returned, and no more willing to talk about what happened on the flats than she was. Driel was next. 3 cracked thoracic plates, the broken arm, the neck laceration, the shrapnel wounds across his back. The medics cataloged him with the quiet intensity of professionals encountering damage that should have been incapacitating and wasn't. As they lifted the stretcher, his working hand found Marin's wrist again, the same grip, the same pressure, the same word. She squeezed back. The stretcher went into the dropship and the ramp sealed and the engines spooled and another piece of the afternoon lifted away. Haruk sat on the ramp of the 3rd dropship and stared at his utility blade. He hadn't put it down. She didn't tell him to. Some things you held onto because letting go meant admitting the need was over and the body wasn't ready to believe that yet. It would take time. It would take nights where the clicking came back and mornings where the scales went pale for no reason anyone could name. But he would keep the blade on his kit for the rest of his deployment. And one day, months from now, on a different world, in a different fight, he would draw it again, and his hands would not shake, and the memory of this afternoon would be the reason. She remembered something Palk had said, once, on a night march through the volcanic lowlands of Sarathi 6. They'd been carrying a wounded Tershi soldier through 6 kilometers of terrain that was actively trying to kill them, and Marin had asked why. Why carry something that heavy that far for someone they'd known for 3 days? Palk had looked at her with the flat, patient expression of a man, explaining something so fundamental that the need to explain it was itself a kind of failure. "Because they'd carry you," he said. "And because the day you stop carrying, you stop being the thing that's worth carrying for." She hadn't understood it then. Not really. Not the way you understand something that's lived in your bones long enough to become load-bearing. She understood it now, sitting in the rubble with Driel's untranslatable words still warm in her ears and a Delvani holding a kitchen knife like it was a sword and a flag and a promise. Marin walked to the edge of the rubble and looked south toward the empty ridgeline. The Kethvaari had withdrawn completely. No observation posts, no rearguard, no stragglers. Clean and total. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a field commander was filing an after-action report that would note the force ratio, the engagement duration, the ammunition expenditure, and the anomalous outcome. The report would be analyzed. The flag would be raised. An analyst would mark it explained. The unit had included a human. That was always the explanation. The convenient one. The one that fit the existing models and let everyone sleep. The analyst wouldn't note the Telvari who fought with a kitchen knife. Wouldn't log the Telvari who shielded a radio with his body. Wouldn't record the corporal who held center on a shattered leg, because holding center was what he did, and the leg was not going to change that. Marin would note it. She carried it in the same place she carried Palk. The quiet ledger where the things that mattered lived. The ledger that no after-action report would ever contain because the things that mattered didn't fit in columns. The last dropship's crew chief waved her aboard. She picked up her empty sidearm, ejected the spent magazine by force of habit, tucked the weapon into its holster, and walked across the rubble toward the ramp. Her boots crunched on fused glass where the lance bolts had hit. The sun was still high. The fires were guttering out, the hydrogen spent, the composites reduced to black skeletons that would cool and stand and become landmarks on a map that nobody would want to visit. The Kethvari would recalculate. They always did. They'd refine the models, update the variables, add new parameters for human endurance and Deathworld sprint capacity and pain tolerance, and the 10,000 years of evolutionary pressure that had turned a soft-skinned primate into something their tables couldn't predict. But they'd never find the column for the blade. They'd never quantify the prey animal that chose to stand. Marin climbed aboard. The ramp closed behind her, sealing out the white sun and the black smoke and the flat, empty flats where 4 craters marked the place where 4 people had held because 4 was enough. It was always enough.